Hey dudes, it's Lerald. So we're about 7 months into Settlers League, we're about 2.5 months into Path of Exile 2 Early Access, and that means that we've gone through a bit of a drought now in terms of new stuff to get hyped about. That ends now with the dawn of teaser season for the upcoming Legacy of Phrecia event. Or maybe Phrecia, maybe? I don't know, it doesn't matter. So, if your only experience with Path of Exile as a game is playing through Path of Exile 2, I do think, I haven't really done we haven't like put out a full-fledged review of PoE 2 on the channel yet. Here's what I'll say. It's kind of an incomplete game still. Very good. I think the campaign is definitely more new player friendly than PoE 1's, but just in general, this is a pretty good inroad for people who don't really have experience with PoE 1 to kind of come play the game when it's in a really weird, wacky state, but also like a really good base game state, and just kind of get sucked into the game that's addicted all of us who are already big in on it. So this event, in terms of what it's going to be, as they said in the announcement, basically they gave the announcement that they didn't have a 3.26 update planned, which is kind of bad news for everybody, or worked on, I should say, and so they would just be running kind of a 1-month event with wacky ideas. These wacky ideas are extremely wacky, and that's actually pretty great. I'm going to go through all of them. They're mostly focused on just like replacing all of the existing Ascendancies with something very weird, and in I think a lot of cases based on some sort of unique items that exist in a game that are kind of generally not that well used, but this is cool, right? It gives us something to kind of get excited about and experiment with and think about moving forward. I guess there are kind of two big unknowns that I should mention first. We don't know what league this is going to be in, whether it's going to be in Settlers League. I would assume that's what it's going to be in, but we just don't know. Settlers League might not be it, or maybe we're going to return to some old league for this, or who knows. And then also, when is it? We know that it's going to last for 1 month, since that's what they said, but we don't actually know when that month is going to start. I would imagine it's probably kind of late February, maybe early March, and then we would get the next PoE 2 update probably like 3 weeks after that. And then 3.26 would hopefully drop like a month and a half after that big PoE 2 update, although, maybe that's copium, but we'll see. All right, so our first Ascendancy here is the Gambler. We have Risk Aversion right at the top. I'm just going to go through these all clockwise, so I'll start at the top. And Risk Aversion, 50% chance to avoid LE elements and avoid being stunned. 50% of each of these on their own is like worthless. I mean, not worthless, but not very good. You really want those numbers to both be 100%. This obviously makes it a lot easier to hit 100%. I think this is a good node. The only real problem with it is that all of the rest of the branches in this tree are 2-point nodes that you really... Pretty much you definitely want to hit the second node on the really good one, so I think you're probably never going to use Risk Aversion, even though it is like kind of a nice quality of life node. Risky Exploit is the second node here, and this is crazy strong. 50% chance for your elemental resistances to count as being 90% against enemy hits. If we count like, let's say we're taking like a 10,000 damage hit, right? So if it's 90%, that basically is the same as being like times 0.1, so 10,000 hit becomes 1,000 hit. And, if you were to say take that same hit with like 75% damage reduction, that's a 2,500 damage hit. So 50%, 1,000, 50%, 2,500. This is a pretty huge amount of damage reduction for a single point. And then the only downside is 25 minus elemental resistances. It's not maximum resistances, it's just minus resistances. That's pretty easy to overcome. You can use Purity of Elements. And then you can also stack this with Kilowava's Bluster. This is a really useless shield right now because you can only get 30 to 40% chance. And then the rest of the stats on it just aren't that amazing, right? Like okay chance to block, evasion rating, whatever, but like a little bit of avoid ailments. Rare shields are often very, very strong. Huge amount of value you can get from a rare shield. And this node just isn't good enough to compensate for that on its own. But they'll stack with each other, so you can get 90% chance for your elemental resistances to be 90% against enemy hits. That's insane. And then you get some other quality of life in here too, and actually a pretty decent amount of block chance, and that's wild. Now, hypothetically speaking, you can also stack this with like Lore Weave or Replica Lore Weave once the League event has kind of opened up a bit and people are running Heist and they've farmed up Replica Lore Weaves and you can actually get your hands on one. These could stack pretty well together. That really compensates for the very big downside of Replica Lore Weave, which is a pretty great body armor. It has a ton of great stats on it, but that downside of low resistances is super brutal. But then something I've always liked about Lore Weave is when you run maps that have like a minus max all res penalty on them, Lore Weave just completely cancels it out. And that's one of the worst mods you can possibly find on a map. So like, that's really nice. Then there's reversed odds. You have 50% chance to treat monster enemy elemental resistance values as inverted. This does exactly what it says it does. If you're fighting an enemy that has like 50 fire res, then you have a 50% chance for that fire res to be negative 50 fire res, which is insane. And then if you have elemental penetration throughout your tree or your gear or whatever, then that will then penetrate off of that final number. So if you had 50 fire res on an enemy and 10 elemental penetration, you'll hit them, it'll invert the resistance to negative 50, and then your penetration will bump it further to negative 60. That's also good. And here I have Lightning Strike Slayer pulled up. This is a Lightning Strike Slayer build that I played in Settler League, and like this Ascendancy node, or this Mastery node right here, Elemental Mastery, 25% chance for your hits to treat enemy monster elemental resistance values as inverted. This is huge. Like, I mean, you can see in this is a 13% damage increase, and it stacks with reversed odds to be 75% chance, and then Forces of Nature is another 10% LE pen as well there. So like, just super value here for risky exploit and reversed odds. I think it's very obvious you would run Lightning Strike. I don't think there's a better skill to run, and you would just get a massive amount of damage out of that, and then you could run Kilowavus Bluster, and then you're borderline immune to all the elemental damage that you're going to run into just by taking these two nodes. Pretty amazing. Then the next two nodes, I think, pretty much like synergize with that beautifully as well. You have Overly Confident, which just kind of gives you like an extra defensive lifeline. Damage of enemies hitting you is unlucky when you're on low life. Pretty simple, right? If your health is low, then enemy damage gets rolled twice, and the lower value gets chosen as the value of the damage of the hits. That also synergizes pretty well with the damage reduction of Risky Exploit. You know, it's like layers of RNG of defense that kind of all synergize with each other. And while this build, the character that I have here, does not run Petrified Blood, you absolutely could run Pet Blood and give yourself, you know, basically permanent low life, and then that all damage from enemy hits would be unlucky. The problem, of course, is that doesn't account for environmental damage, so maybe you don't want to do that. I just don't love Petrified Blood, just conceptually. I don't like being on permanent low life, so, you know, whatever. And then the next Ascendancy node here is either the choice of heads or tails, so you can have either your spell block or attack block be lucky and then the other be unlucky. So I think the approach here is, again, just to run Kilowavus Bluster, make your attack block lucky. So that, again, means it gets multiplied twice, or, you know, rolled twice, and then the good result is taken. And then just like, I mean, really just like with playing with the Svalin Lightning Strike Slayer that I've played throughout the league, where I have like 87% block chance on attack and spells, and I have all of these block nodes over here, Deflection and Testudo and Shield Mastery and Block Mastery and so on to get this super high block chance. You know, you're not getting that spell block chance if you take Tails, right? But you are getting that level of physical block chance, and you don't have the downside of Svalin reducing your max block by 10% or whatever it is. I think minus 10%, right? So you have a little bit of spell block, but then you also have the 90% or so chance to count as 90% LE res on all enemy elemental hits. So that works, right? That totally compensates for that. I think you can also run spell suppression. I've seen some people talking about running things like Elevor, this helm that's just very common and cheap, gives you spell suppression chance and life when you suppress spell damage. That's an option, but it's kind of a crappy helm, so I think you're better off just running like normal gear, and then basically instead of Svalin in this sort of Lightning Strike setup, you are running Kilowavus Bluster in this Gambler setup with the lucky block chance and then unlucky spell block, and then you're pretty much immortal, I think, with these 4 points. Then that leaves the other 2 points here: Growing Accumulator, this kind of chance to deal triple and double damage, but then you deal 25% less damage. This is sort of spiky. I don't really love this core concept of growing accumulator, but I get it. It's like a 15 or 18% damage increase, assuming you have no double or triple damage anywhere in your gear. And then if you do have any of that anywhere in your build at all, then it drops in value quite a bit. Spectacular Parlay is an interesting concept as well, because it makes your crit chance lucky, which is like really good if you're around 50% crit chance. It basically turns that into 75%. If your crit chance is fairly low, then it's really just not enough for it to be good. You know, like if you only had like 10% crit chance, this would bump it up to like 19%. Not great. And then similarly, if you have like 90% crit chance, it's only going to bump that up into like mid 90s. So again, not amazing at like really good or really bad gear levels, only kind of at mid gear levels, and damage with your hits being unlucky is a pretty huge downside. So I actually think growing accumulator and spectacular parlay for builds that I would think of don't seem that great. They're kind of in there with risk aversion. I think you're clearly just going to run the other 4 points and have insane damage and probably play Lightning Strike. Basically play this as sort of like a Lightning Strike Gladiator, conceptually, kinda, or maybe even like Lightning Strike Champion is sort of the feel that you would get out of this, but I think it could be potentially a lot stronger than either of those two Ascendancies have ever been as a Lightning Strike build. Very, very good. I really like this one a lot. All right, for our next Ascendancy, we have the Harbinger, and I just want to point out this node right, or this bonus of it right here. As a bonus, you get to fly and be blue. This is something I haven't really seen other people talking about, but getting to turn into a Harbinger is like fun and thematic, so I do like that a lot. So I can't pronounce any of these names. These are all in Harbingerese. That's not a language I read or speak, but I can just start with this node here. The 40% cooldown recovery rate node is pretty great. If we look at Craft of Exile, the highest amount of cooldown recovery you can get on a single piece of rare gear, a Shaper belt, is 20% right here. Tier 1, 16 to 20% cooldown recovery rate as a belt mod. So 40% is pretty good. This is a really good node if you're playing a build that uses a cooldown of some kind. The problem is that PoE 1 is not Diablo. There aren't really that many skills that have tons and tons of cooldowns. And so, like, you can look at cast when channeling or cast on crit builds. I think those are the two concepts that really fit this best. And I think cast while channeling makes much more sense for like lower budget, you know, just out of the campaign kind of setups than cast on crit, which really requires a lot more budget, a lot more gear to really make work. And so I think you could do something like build around this, build around the cooldown recovery rate and some other stuff that's right in this area, and do like a cast while channeling Soul Rend or maybe Forbidden Rite kind of setup. Forbidden Rite will be a little bit more difficult, but some sort of cast while channeling spell. You know, I mean, you can use anything, Arc, Fireball, Frostbolt, whatever you want, but Soul Rend is definitely something that's very well liked. So that's an option. All right, and then getting into the next skill, the Summon Harbinger of Time, or Greater Harbinger of Time, Greater Harbinger of Focus, and Greater Harbinger of the Arcane. These all, like, you know, they don't say what they are, but they actually are things that we know what they are from a very old piece of content from Harbinger League. There are some uniques that are in the game that are actually kind of a big chore to put together, but there are 3 of them. The Immortal Will, the Surging Thoughts, and the Torrent's Reclamation that are all being represented on this tree. I think there are like 6 of them in total, but 3 of them are being represented in this tree. And the thing about all of these is that they're kind of forgotten. They're kind of not really very used. They're kind of not really that strong. Basically, the way that all 3 of these work is they summon an Immortal Harbinger minion, like a blue guy who shows up near you, and then he has it's like a buff he casts on you on a cooldown, and that's pretty much it. And so I'll just start with the Harbinger of Time that comes from the Torrent's Reclamation. So what this does is the dude casts every 10 seconds on you. He'll cast a buff that lasts for 8 seconds, and it gives you 10% action speed. That's 10% cast speed, move speed, attack speed, so on. You know, not the most amazing buff on its own, like pretty good. 10% action speed is actually very good. But with that being said, you know, you are spending an Ascendancy point on this, and it's not going to be off all the time. It's 8 seconds for 10-second cooldown, 8-second buff. Yeah, that does make it harder to line up like cast on crit, that sort of thing. Except then the very next node that, once again, I can't pronounce or anything, gives you buffs expire 30% slower and debuffs expire 30% faster. Good. So this means that a 10-second buff would take 13 seconds to fall off, an 8-second buff would take a little over 10 seconds to fall off, and so that does mean that this buff would be permanent uptime 100% as long as you're combining these 3 nodes. Then you have the Summon Greater Harbinger of Focus skill that comes from the Immortal Will, and what that does is really strong. It's 4 seconds of buff uptime with 8-second cooldown, and it gives you immunity to status ailments. That's all of them. That's like freeze, shock, ignite, bleed, poison, all of that. Stun immunity, 20% damage reduction, and curse immunity. Insane. The only problem with it is that you do have to be channeling in order to have that buff applied to you. So this pretty much means you're going to have to play some sort of cast while channeling Cyclone build. Again, put whatever spell you want in, but you're going to have to be cycloning all the time. Spinning to win, you basically become like a Diablo 2 barbarian, just spinning constantly in order to get this buff, but it's insanely strong. The problem with it is 4 seconds of uptime on an 8-second cooldown, and I don't know 100% whether this cooldown recovery rate copies over to your minions, but I would assume it doesn't. So because of that, you're getting 30% increased uptime out of this bonus here. So 4 times 1.3, that's like 5.25 seconds. That's not 8. So I don't know that you're going to get 100% uptime from the Immortal Will buff. As good as it is, this means you're only getting partial like uptime on immunity and stun immunity and curses and damage reduction and so on. Now there is another item that has some of these same bonuses, and it's definitely like an influence for this entire Ascendancy, and that's the Solstice Vigil. It is a Shaper unique, kind of a legendary Shaper unique. Temp Chains has no reservation if cast as an aura, and then Shaper's Presence when you kill a rare unique enemy, lasts 10 seconds, and it gives you 20% slower debuff, or buff expiration, I should say. And that's pretty interesting, right? It would also stack with this, so your buffs would expire 50% slower, which would mean, I think, pretty close to full uptime on all of these buffs. So that's a potential, right? You could line all these up together, have pretty close to full uptime, or maybe potentially full uptime on those buffs, at least after you've killed a rare or unique. Hi, it's Editing Lerald here, and yeah, I went and checked the PoE wiki, and if you had 50% slower expiration rate, just the math on that for an 8-second cooldown, 4 divided by 0.5 is 8, so that would be 100% uptime. Also, one other thing to consider is we don't know what the small passives are. They may give you enough to actually get you over that threshold without needing Solstice Vigil as well. Then you have this next node that gives you Curse and Chill and Shock immunity while you're channeling. It's an interesting concept. It kind of just feels reductive, like redundant with the Greater Harbinger of Focus, but like easier to apply. You start channeling your Whirlwind or whatever, and then you're good. And then you have this node here that gives you increased effective Hex skills, which does, I think, mean that it would be possible to play Impending Doom again, which is cool. I loved that build back when it worked. And then also, again, the Tempest Temporal Chains being free if you're using it as a blasphemy with Solstice Vigil. That's really great. Temporal Chains is very, very strong. I like that a lot. There's potential you could use this along with like a Curse on Hit Ring for a Hex Blast setup, but then, I don't know about the rest of the gear, rest of the Ascendancy really working with Hex Blast. And then there's, of course, just Energy Shield, Mana Recovery Rate. This seems like the one node in the entire tree that could be kind of useful while doing the campaign, while leveling. Like, this could be okay. And then finally, we cap off with the Greater Harbinger of the Arcane. That's the Surging Thoughts bonus. And this guy, he basically just gives you like Arcane Surge. Again, about 50% uptime on Arcane Surge. That means cast speed, mana regen, and then also you get Chance to Shock and Lightning Pin. None of that is really all that great. I can't really see any Ascendancy that benefits from that hugely. Or any build setup, I should say, that benefits from this Ascendancy node. So I actually think this branch is pretty weak for high-level builds. The real setup I see here is just simply like a cast while channeling setup over here on the right-hand side. I don't really think this Ascendancy is all that great, which is kind of disappointing because it is very cool to be a Harbinger, but it just doesn't seem that strong right now. I'm sure I'm missing something. I'm sure there's an Ascendancy or a setup that could make use of this Ascendancy very effectively. All right, the next Ascendancy I'm going to look at is the Architect of Chaos. We start off with Chaos Reigns at the very top of the tree, 3 to level of all Vol skill gems. This is insanely strong for any sort of Vol spell skills. So if you are new to PoE 1, you've only played PoE 2, Vol skills are kind of like cooldowns. They are bundled into the same skill gem. Skill gems in PoE 1 are at much more of a premium. There's a lot less room for them than there is in PoE 2. And so there are skills like Lightning Strike, very strong skill, one of my favorite skills in the game, maybe my favorite skill in the game these days. And then you can also have Vol Lightning Strike, which basically just gives you like this big cooldown, except instead of being a cooldown that's time gated, it's gated on killing enemies. You have to kill enemies, capture their souls by doing so up to a certain number, and then you're able to press the Vol skill, and then it does something else. In the case of Vol Lightning Strike, it summons, it basically like summons an orb that will attack for you, doing a stronger version of the skill that you're using. In the case of like Vol Caustic Arrow, it shoots out a bunch of extra caustic arrows that do a bunch of extra damage. That's pretty much how all the Vol skills do. It does like just an enhanced version of the basic skill. And then there is the limitation of having to kill enemies to build up the charges to use it. And then also there is a cooldown after you've used it in which you can no longer generate souls. And depending on how strong the skill is, that is kind of going to affect how strong or how long the cooldown is. And so this tree is built around maximizing the value of Vol skills and +3 to level of Vol skill gems for spells, for things like Vol Fireball or Vol Arc or Vol Firestorm or something like that. This is insanely strong. This is like world-shatteringly strong. 3 levels is a crazy amount of damage. We're talking 20% more damage or more, depending on the rest of your setup. All right, so Glimpse Chaos is the next node here, I guess. It's technically not connected to Chaos Reigns. It's just setting as its own branch, but I'll hit on it next since it's right here. And this is very much a node that is going to be really, really, really strong once your gear is kind of fully min-maxed and you're able to compensate for the massive reduction in resistances. So yeah, 10 pieces of gear. So if all of them are corrupted, and if you're taking Glimpse Chaos, they should be. That's -40 all res, that's 80% increased max life, that's 12 or 120% increased max energy shield. That is a massive bonus, but it's also a massive downside. 40 all res is not trivial to compensate for, especially considering that also includes chaos res. That's not just all elemental resistances, that's pretty big. So this is very, very like clearly just another version of Shadow Stitch, which has all these same functions minus all reses, increased max ES and life. You could combine these together. That would be a really huge downside to overcome though. 80 all res is like, that's crazy. So I don't know that you would want to combine that, but obviously that would be a huge ES and life bonus if you could. Definitely that's going to take some really high level gear for that to work though. Depose Order is the next Ascendancy here, the next Ascendancy node, and it's connected to Chaos Reigns, pretty great, and it has two like big positives and actually no downside, which is kind of interesting. 50% reduced soul gain prevention duration, so when you use Vol skill, you get that soul gain prevention. That is cut in half, that's pretty good. And then 286% increased Vol skill crit chance. This is going to make it very easy to crit cap on any of those Vol skills if you're playing one of these caster builds like Vol Spark or Vol Arc or something. It's going to be really easy to hit 100% crit on that Vol skill, have it be available very often, and then also have it get just a ton more damage. All right, Impure Blood is next, along with Hewn Flesh. These are in the same wheel here. Impure Blood, I think, is very good. It makes it so that your skills cost life instead of mana, but it doesn't do the thing that Blood Magic does where it sets your mana to 0, so you're able to spend all of your mana on reserving spells, or auras. 100% of it. You can reserve your mana all the way down to literally 0 and still be able to cast spells. That's pretty great. Hewn Flesh, on the other hand, I think is much less good. It makes it so that your skills will then reserve life, but then you get 100% increased life reservation efficiency of skills, so you could reserve the same number of skills, but only reserve half of your health. But that's still more than none of your health, which I think is like kind of a big point of weakness there. Now, there is one positive here, and that's Eternal Blessing support. So Eternal Blessing support makes it so that you can't reserve any mana. Because you wouldn't be reserving any mana, you would basically be doing nothing with your mana. Maybe you could use Mind Over Matter or something to use some of your mana for that purpose. That's about the only way I could see doing this and making it make sense. You would still be able to use Eternal Blessing to get an extra aura in at the cost of no mana, and also with all the increased aura effect that you get out of Eternal Blessing. So I see that as a possibility, but that's a lot of expense for one extra aura. I don't really love Hewn Flesh and Impure Blood. Or I should say, I don't love spending 2 nodes, 2 points to come down and take Hewn Flesh. I do like Impure Blood quite a bit. I think the combination of Depose Order, Chaos Reigns, and Impure Blood is very good. Now, Dissolution makes it sort of works like Dissolution of the Flesh, which is a unique jewel. Captain Lance's favorite unique, my favorite unique jewel. I think the downside of taking this node as opposed to Dissolution of the Flesh is Dissolution of the Flesh gives you 20 to 30% more max life. That's a more multiplier. That's a huge amount of extra life. You can get really huge life pool when you're running Dissolution of the Flesh. It does have a 2-second window instead of a 1-second window. But with that being said, it basically just means like if you take no damage for a full second with Dissolution, then you're back at full health again. That's pretty cool. I like the concept, and that does synergize really nicely with Impure Blood, where you can be spending life but not reserving life, so you're not actually any closer to death by spending tons of life to cast skills. I like that aspect of it. The downside is, of course, if you're taking any sort of damage over time, bleed, ignite, poison, whatever, then Dissolution is terrible. All right, the next node here, Everlasting Sacrifice and Shepherd of Souls from Forbidden Secrets. Shepherd of Souls is weird. It makes it so your Vol skills that aren't auras cost way less, but then when you cast them, the cost increases. You know, I don't really love this. It sort of creates a situation where you kind of like spam cast a Vol skill a bunch of times in quick succession and then like wait a full 8 seconds for it to fall off and then repeat that. I just don't love that. Right now, there are only 2 sources of Shepherd of Souls. You can runesmith it, which we don't know if Settler League is going to be in this event or not, or you can use this otherwise pretty bad mace or scepter, Yamax Accord. It's pretty rare, pretty bad. Nobody really uses this, so I think that this is an Ascendancy node that's not really all that great. Everlasting Sacrifice is only available from one node or one source, and that is Maxottl's Machination. Formerly one of my favorite uniques. It's not really that great anymore. And the way this works is when you overcap your energy shield, you sacrifice all of it to gain 5 max all res, and that includes chaos. It lasts 4 seconds. This is pretty good in a super overleeching build. With that being said, it does cause you to consume all of your ES, so you don't want to be relying on ES as a source of defense, but you also do need to have some energy shield, so you couldn't use this with Dissolution. They're like mutually exclusive with each other. So not a huge fan of Forbidden Secrets. I think it's going to be pretty complex to actually make that be good. And then finally, our last node here is Fever for Corruption. I think this synergizes really well. This whole top wheel has great synergy. 50% increased Vol skill effect duration. That's really good with some of the Vol skills, Vol support, Vol spell skills, I should say. And then also 50% reduced souls per use. That's just awesome. You're just going to be able to, in conjunction with like Depose Order and Fever for Corruption, you're just going to be hitting Vol skills over and over and over again. They're going to be critting constantly. They're going to be lasting a long time, and they're going to be doing tons of damage thanks to Chaos Reigns. And then I think your last option here is just Impure Blood, you know, quality of life, preserve 100% of your mana. Now, the downside of all of this is super offensive of setup in that approach. Like, there's basically no defense in this tree at all, so you're going to have to compensate for that pretty hard. Probably just by running multiple defensive auras. That's probably the value you're getting out of Impure Blood, is just running like, I don't know, Discipline and Grace, something like that. Discipline and Determination. There you go. All right, we're on to our final Ascendancy here, and that is the Servant of Arakaali. This has basically 2 concepts built into it. One is Aspect of the Spider, is all of the left-hand side, and that's actually something that I kind of like, and I think it could synergize pretty well with the Viper Strike of the Mamba Pathfinder. This is a Shadow setup, so you could run this sort of as like a Viper Strike of the Mamba Assassin or Trickster, maybe. This is the wrong tree. Here we go, Viper Strike of the Mamba Pathfinder. I had set up kind of like this, and this character was able to hit the dot cap pretty easily at like low 90s, and like it has good gear, but not truly insane gear. The only really valuable thing is like the Ralakesh's Impatience. Otherwise, the rest of the gear, these are 5 passive voices, these are like 10 Chaos Orbs or something. Very nice crafted weapons, I will say that. But you could just run like Bino's Kitchen Knives instead, since you don't have built-in poison spreading, and that would definitely work. So in terms of the nodes here, I'll just start with kind of the top and talk about the stuff on the right-hand side, which is very clearly just an Arakaali's Fang setup. Weaver's Contrition gives you level 20 Penance Mark. Penance Mark is a skill that was added very briefly in Affliction League. Penance Mark makes it so that you mark an enemy, and then when you hit them, when they get hit, they spawn phantasms. You're able to kill those phantasms pretty easily. They don't have a lot of health, and that then is useful for triggering on death effects. That's pretty much it. Not super strong on its own, but you have Broodguard over here that gives you level 20 raised spiders on kill. Compare this to Arakaali's Fang, which is a pretty beloved build that people really do like. Gives you a 100% chance to trigger Level 1 raised spiders on kill, you know, that difference between level 20 and level 1 is interesting. I think it's probably to compensate for the fact that the reason Arakaali's Fang is good is you can put 3 sockets into it, and then you can run the Squire as your offhand and put three skill gems into that and actually juice those spiders to be very strong. So the way the spiders work is you summon them, they attack your enemies with Viper Strike, they do damage, they aren't real minions, they can't be damaged, they can't tank anything, they just simply do a lot of damage. Now, because they use Viper Strike, they poison on hit, so Skin Crawlers is kind of worthless for the spiders, but the chance to inflict Withered is good. This is very much a minion setup, right? Obviously. And that's exactly the way you want to think about it. So I was thinking about this, and the first thing that came to mind was this this weapon right here from Harvest. Law of the Wilds gives you a chance to trigger a Spectral Wolf when you crit. The weapon itself does very little damage, but it gives you crit chance, it gives you crit multi, so you could synergize this in some way with doing some more damage, but I think pretty much it's just going to be for summoning wolves, right? And then you also have this node here, Neurotoxin, which gives you minions have crit multiplier based on the Withered debuffs, so that benefits having a lot more minions. So trigger that Wither on hit. And then probably withering yourself as well, like just having withering touch, like in your Cyclone or whatever you're using to trigger this and to trigger Broodguard and so on, probably Cyclone. And then also the bottom note here is that the base crit chance of your minions is based on the crit chance of your weapon, which this actually does have a pretty decent crit chance, so you could roll that up, maybe try and get that even higher through enchants and stuff, and that actually would give you like pretty much just a quick boost to having crit minions. Pretty basic, like self-contained build here, works pretty well. Now, with that being said, it is minions in Path of Exile, so a lot of people are not going to be in love with this, and I don't blame them. All right, the next thing here is this, again, 3-point wheel of Aspect of the Spider. Aspect of the Spider puts a debuff on enemies that makes them take 5% increased damage. It applies that debuff every second, and the level 1 Aspect of the Spider stacks 3 times. The higher level version, the level 30 version, stacks 4 times. So 20% more damage on enemies, that's pretty huge. And also free Hinder, which is 30% slow, that's also pretty good. Very basic, right? Just simply like a big damage and kind of semi... I wouldn't really say defensive exactly, but utility-oriented aura. Pretty good. And then you have Silk Dancer, which also makes it so that those enemies deal 15% reduced damage. It's not per stack, so you're not getting 60% DR, but still 15% is pretty good. And 15% minus all res. So this is technically usable as any sort of Ascendancy or skill setup, right? You could use this as like something that deals elemental damage, but then Fatal Bite up here makes it so that you gain 30% of Fizz as extra chaos when you're at max power charges, and you generate power charges when you hit an enemy affected by a web. So basically all the time you hit, you're going to generate power charges. This makes it really easy to generate power charges. I've seen a couple of builds floating around for people playing like, or putting together the concept of like some sort of maybe Shield Crush, or I've played Spectral Shield Throw in the past, like some sort of poison on hit skill. I think Cobra Lash makes the most sense. I did, like I said, I played around with Viper Strike of the Mamba Pathfinder right before PoE 2 came out. You know, I've got that little bit of footage here. The only problem with kind of comparing this and that, as much as I loved this build, this is an Ascendancy right here that has pretty limited defenses. It has the damage reduction from Aspect of the Spider, and that's kind of it. And, you know, like no utility in terms of like moving quickly or anything like that. And then also having to rely on this as your power charge generation is maybe not great, because the whole point of Viper Strike of the Mamba is that you stab once and then that's it, you walk away. So this, I think, actually lends itself more to a regular Viper Strike or Cobra Lash, or something that's hitting quite a bit more often. And, you know, there is some appeal there. I could see this being interesting, but I don't know that this is necessarily the best setup for this Ascendancy, but maybe there's something there. Viper Strike of the Mamba does so much damage, it's so easy to scale the damage, that honestly just having this Fatal Bite be a dead node is like, it's still something that could work. You could probably make Viper Strike of the Mamba work without an Ascendancy. All right, one final note on Fatal Bite here is that obviously you can just use Relic Heshes and Patience once you have them available. That'll certainly work for always being capped on power charges and making that Fatal Bite 30% of Fizz extra chaos work. And then, you know, depending on the rest of your gear and so on, playing around with this a little bit in PoB, This is potentially like 15% more damage, which is huge. You know, you got Silk Dancer and Fatal Bite and Thread Spinner all giving you somewhere in the range of like 15 to 20% more damage each. And then the final point here, Malevolent Strands is just free real estate. It's just free damage. You can get Envy through rune crafting, and it's a pretty huge damage increase. If I turn it off, you can see I lose like 10 million DPS. I'm over the damage cap right now, and I lose about 10 million DPS from Envy. And so instead of getting that and just having to like kind of jankily make it work, it's just free, is really huge. So you do the first lab, you take Malevolent Strands, and then that basically is all the damage you could possibly need for the entire rest of the campaign. So that aspect of it is pretty good. So I think the free damage you get out of Malevolent Strands and then the whole rest of this, I think works really well for any sort of poison on hit build, which I do love those. I could see playing, like I said, Cobra Lash or maybe real Viper Strike or Pestilent Strike or something and making this be pretty good. So this one is the one of the four that appeals to me the most in terms of like being kind of creative and fun. I think pretty obviously of the four, though, I think that the Gambler is looking like the strongest by far. You set this up as a Lightning Striker, and you know, that's pretty much it. It's pretty much free real estate. I think this could be as strong as Lightning Strike Slayer was with Sval in this league, except instead you're running super cheap stuff like Kilowava's Bluster and Tails, and you know, also like combining with Risky Exploit and stuff. Okay, the video is all done. I have it uploaded. It's completely finished. And then 4 minutes ago, 4 minutes ago, I guess 7 now, GGG just dropped this in about the upcoming Legacy of Phrecia event, that instead of having the Atlas passive skill tree at all, we're going to find idols as we progress through the end game. You can put them into this weird new tab on the map receptacle UI. It's sort of like a hybrid of the Sanctum idol UI or Relic UI, and then, you know, like, I guess just a brand new system, really. And here are just a couple of examples. You know, they're the magic idols, rare idols, all unmodifiable unique idols are keystones from the Atlas passive skill tree. They're tradable, but not modifiable, right? So drawing a lot from, I guess from Heist mostly, and you're gonna just get like combinations of things. Abyss Cracks do stuff, Delirium, Breaches, Einhar. So very interesting here. This is gonna make it so, you know, just thinking off the top of the dome here, this is going to make it so that Scarabs that guarantee spawn in something, Betrayal or something, Scarabs that normally would be worth, you could buy like 100 of them for 1 in Chaos Orb, those are actually going to be worth something now, because you're not just going to be able to very easily guarantee that a League mechanic spawns on your maps, so that's pretty good. It's going to definitely have a weird impact on the relative values of Scarabs, since we will still have Scarabs, we just won't have our Atlas passive tree. This is pretty cool. You know, I think this is going to be like another type of currency to try and farm. Like, you could just set up idle farm strategies, and that seems pretty interesting. Ironically, idle farm being a very active thing, you know, hunting them down, looking at them, knowing how to price out specific combinations of attributes. That's pretty interesting. This is so experimental. I think the one piece of feedback that I've seen over and over again is GGG, please let this last longer than a month. There's so many experiments happening at once, so we really want this to last longer than a month here. And I think they said in here somewhere, here it is. Given that players will likely want to experiment with the Ascendancy class as an alternate endgame, there'll be something they'll add as private league options at some point after the event. Yeah, I mean, I still would like for this to at least last like 6-8 weeks, unless they have some other even crazier stuff planned. But this is pretty crazy, right? So, you know, they have said there's going to be no tree respecking, obviously. You just take out the idols you don't want and put in the ones you do. That's pretty simple. They did also say in here somewhere that because they are being experimental with this, they're not like giving, you know, great inventory management. We're going to have to just do the inventory management ourselves and just have boring dump tabs full of random idols. So yeah, there's going to be that. But, you know, I'm like on board for this. This feels like a Path of Exile 2 feature that they're back playing with in PoE 1 to just kind of get some testing and get some feedback on it, and I love that. Like, I think there's some pretty interesting stuff in here that I'm super hyped about, and just something different and new feels good. Even if it sucks, just the fact that it's new and different is cool. All right, I think that pretty much covers it. This event is looking like it's going to be really fun. I'm definitely looking forward to even more of the Ascendancy options coming out and just kind of breaking those down as they come out, so it's not quite so long. All right, be sure to like and subscribe, all of that outro stuff. That's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.